Eddie died thinking you finally understood us, but you're still treating us like sideshows." The words hit Hulk Hogan like a chair shot to the chest. Rey Mysterio stood in front of him, all 5'6" and 175 pounds of righteous fury, his mask unable to hide the pain and anger radiating from his entire being. What happened in the next few minutes would force Hogan to confront uncomfortable truths about wrestling's most persistent prejudice. June 15, 2006. WWE Corporate Offices, Stamford, Connecticut. The meeting had been called to discuss Rey Mysterio's controversial World Heavyweight Championship reign, which had divided fans, critics, and industry insiders since WrestleMania 22. Some celebrated it as a breakthrough moment for smaller wrestlers, others dismissed it as a sympathy vote following Eddie Guerrero's death. Rey had requested this meeting personally, not through his agent or WWE management. He needed to address something that had been eating at him for months, something that went deeper than championship reigns or storylines. It was about respect, representation, and the promises that had been made to a dead friend. The conference room felt different from the usual creative meetings. There was tension in the air, the kind that comes when personal grievances intersect with business realities. Rey sat across from Hulk Hogan, who had been brought in as a consultant to help evaluate the company's current direction and star power. Hogan had been discussing Rey's championship reign with typical diplomatic language, but his underlying message was clear: Rey Mysterio was too small to be a credible world heavyweight champion. The title needed to be on someone who looked like a champion, someone who could carry the company's heavyweight division with legitimate physical presence. With all due respect to Rey's heart and technical ability, Hogan had said earlier in the meeting, the World Heavyweight Championship represents something bigger than individual talent. It represents strength, dominance, the pinnacle of sports entertainment. When fans see that belt, they need to believe they're looking at the toughest man in the company. Those words had pushed Rey past his breaking point, not because they were particularly harsh, but because they represented everything Eddie Guerrero had fought against during his final years. The assumption that size equaled legitimacy, that physical appearance mattered more than skill, that certain wrestlers were inherently more championship material than others. Rey had heard these arguments his entire career. Too small for the main event. Better suited for the cruiserweight division. Great for entertainment value, but not heavyweight championship material. He had spent 15 years proving these critics wrong, but apparently the wrestling establishment's mind hadn't changed. "You know what hurts the most about what you just said?" Rey asked, his voice quiet but carrying an edge that made everyone in the room pay attention. "It's not that you think I'm too small to be champion. It's that you're saying exactly what Eddie spent his last conversation with you trying to change." Hogan's expression shifted from confident authority to uncomfortable confusion. "Rey, I'm not sure what you're referring to." "November 10, 2005, Rey interrupted, his voice gaining strength. 3 days before Eddie died. Madison Square Garden. He confronted you about respecting Latino wrestlers, about seeing us as more than stereotypes and sideshows. You promised him you would use your influence to help wrestlers like us get the respect we deserved." The room had gone completely silent. Other WWE executives who had been present for Hogan's championship analysis were now witnessing something much more personal and potentially explosive. "Eddie told me about that conversation," Rey continued, standing up from his chair. "He said you promised to help create opportunities for Latino wrestlers, to speak out when we were being marginalized or stereotyped." Rey's fists clenched at his sides as he fought to control his emotions. "Do you know what his exact words were?" he said. "Rey, I think Hulk finally gets it. I think he's going to help us change how this business sees Latino wrestlers. Eddie died believing you were going to be our ally." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Hogan had indeed made promises to Eddie Guerrero during their final conversation, promises he had genuinely intended to keep. But somehow, in the months following Eddie's death, those commitments had gotten lost in the shuffle of business decisions and traditional wrestling thinking. And now here you are, Rey said, his voice rising with passion, sitting in this same company's boardroom, telling them that I'm too small to represent their championship. That the World Heavyweight Championship needs to be on someone who looks like a champion. Do you hear yourself? Do you understand that you're perpetuating the exact same prejudices Eddie died fighting against? Hogan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The truth of Rey's words was undeniable, but acknowledging them would mean admitting he had failed to honor one of his final promises to a dead friend. Rey, the business realities, Hogan began, but Rey cut him off with a gesture that was surprisingly commanding for such a small man. Don't talk to me about business realities, Rey said firmly. I've been dealing with those realities my entire career. Do you think I don't know that I'm smaller than the typical heavyweight champion? Do you think I haven't heard every argument about credibility and physical presence and looking the part? Rey began pacing the small conference room, his energy filling the space despite his modest physical stature. But you know what? I won this championship not because WWE felt sorry for me, or because they wanted to honor Eddie's memory. I won it because I earned it. Because I've proven for 15 years that size doesn't determine heart, skill doesn't depend on height, and championship material comes in all shapes and sizes. The passion in Rey's voice was transforming the room's atmosphere. Even the WWE executives who had initially agreed with Hogan's size concerns were beginning to see the situation differently. Eddie believed in authentic representation, Rey continued. He believed that wrestling could show kids from all backgrounds that they could achieve greatness regardless of what they looked like or where they came from. When you reduce championship credibility to physical measurements, you're telling millions of fans that their heroes aren't good enough. Hogan was beginning to realize the depth of what Rey was saying. This wasn't just about one wrestler's championship reign or one executive's opinion. This was about systemic bias that had shaped wrestling for decades. Bias that his old friend Eddie Guerrero had died trying to change. You want to know what business reality looks like? Rey asked, pulling out his phone and showing Hogan something on the screen. These are merchandise sales figures, attendance numbers when I'm in the main event, social media engagement when I'm featured prominently. The business reality is that fans connect with authentic excellence regardless of package size. The statistics were impressive, undeniably so. Rey Mysterio's championship reign had actually performed well in most measurable business categories, contradicting the assumption that smaller champions couldn't draw money or maintain audience interest. But this isn't really about business metrics, Rey said, putting his phone away. This is about promises made to a dead friend. This is about whether your word means anything when it's tested by traditional thinking and industry pressure. The accusation stung because it was accurate. Hogan had indeed promised Eddie that he would advocate for Latino wrestlers and speak out against the size-based discrimination that had limited their opportunities. Instead, he had fallen back into the same patterns of thinking that had dominated wrestling for generations. Eddie died thinking you finally understood us, Rey repeated, his voice now carrying the full weight of grief and disappointment. But you're still treating us like sideshows. The silence that followed was profound. Rey had just accused Hulk Hogan, wrestling's most successful performer, of betraying a promise made to a dead friend. More than that, he had exposed the contradiction between Hogan's stated commitment to diversity and his actual business recommendations. When Hogan finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual, lacking its typical confidence and authority. Rey, you're right, I did make promises to Eddie and I haven't kept them. I've been thinking about wrestling the same way I always have, without considering how that thinking affects wrestlers like you. The admission surprised everyone in the room. Hulk Hogan never admitted fault in business meetings, especially not when his expertise was being questioned by someone he had been hired to evaluate. When I see the World Heavyweight Championship, I see it through the lens of my own era. Hogan continued. Big men, powerhouse matches, traditional heavyweight presentations. But that doesn't mean that's the only way or the right way. Rey studied Hogan's face, looking for signs of sincerity or manipulation. What he saw was genuine recognition of failure, and perhaps the beginning of real understanding. Eddie saw something in wrestling that I missed, Hogan said. He saw the potential for this business to be more inclusive, more representative, more willing to redefine what success looks like. I promised him I would help make that vision real, and instead I've been perpetuating the same old biases. The conversation that followed transformed from confrontation to education. Rey explained the specific challenges faced by smaller wrestlers, the assumptions they had to overcome, and the additional scrutiny they faced when given opportunities typically reserved for larger performers. Every time I step into the ring as World Heavyweight Champion, Rey said, I'm not just representing myself, I'm representing every kid who's been told they're too small to achieve their dreams. Every wrestler who's been relegated to the cruiserweight division despite having main event talent. Every fan who sees themselves in someone who doesn't fit the traditional mold. Hogan listened with what appeared to be genuine attention and growing respect. I never thought about the championship that way, he admitted. I saw it as needing to fit a certain image, but you're talking about it changing the image itself. Exactly, Rey said. Instead of asking whether I'm big enough for the championship, maybe we should be asking whether the championship is ready to represent excellence in all forms. The meeting extended far beyond its scheduled time as Rey and Hogan discussed the broader implications of size bias in wrestling, the importance of diverse representation, and practical ways to change industry attitudes about what made someone championship material. By the end, Hogan had committed to publicly supporting Rey's championship reign and using his influence to advocate for opportunities based on talent rather than physical measurements. More importantly, he had renewed his promise to honor Eddie Guerrero's memory by actively promoting diversity and inclusion in wrestling. I owe you an apology, Hogan said as the meeting concluded, and I owe Eddie's memory better than what I've given it. You've reminded me that being a leader in this business means more than just entertaining people. It means opening doors for others and changing minds about what's possible. Rey extended his hand, and they shook with what appeared to be mutual respect and understanding. Eddie would have been proud of this conversation, Rey said, not because you agreed with me, but because you listened and were willing to change. The impact of their conversation was felt immediately throughout WWE. Hogan began publicly praising Rey's championship reign, emphasizing skill and heart over physical measurements. He spoke out against size discrimination in wrestling and actively promoted opportunities for smaller wrestlers who had been overlooked. More importantly, the conversation sparked broader discussions within WWE about representation, opportunity, and the criteria used to evaluate championship potential. Rey's reign was no longer viewed as a sympathy gesture or temporary experiment, but as a legitimate representation of evolving standards for wrestling excellence. Years later, when wrestling historians looked back on the period when smaller wrestlers began receiving more main event opportunities, many pointed to Rey Mysterio's confrontation with Hulk Hogan as a catalyst for change. Rey had used his position as champion not just to entertain fans, but to educate industry leaders about the importance of inclusive excellence. Eddie Guerrero's influence on that conversation was unmistakable. His final discussion with Hogan about respecting Latino wrestlers had planted seeds that Rey's passionate advocacy helped grow into real policy changes and attitude shifts within the wrestling industry. The tragedy was that Eddie never lived to see these changes, but his friend Rey had ensured that his final wishes became reality. Through courage, articulate passion, and unwillingness to accept traditional limitations, Rey Mysterio had honored Eddie's memory while advancing opportunities for future generations of wrestlers who didn't fit conventional molds. Rey Mysterio's championship reign became more than just a title run. It became proof that excellence comes in all sizes, and that the most important battles in wrestling sometimes happen in conference rooms where minds are changed and barriers are broken. The ripple effects of that conversation extended far beyond WWE's corporate offices. Within weeks, other wrestlers began sharing their own stories about size discrimination and the challenges of fighting against traditional expectations in professional wrestling. Smaller wrestlers throughout the industry found new confidence to advocate for themselves, knowing that someone had successfully challenged the establishment's size-based assumptions at the highest level. Independent promotions began featuring more diverse champions, and wrestling schools started teaching that championship potential couldn't be measured in inches or pounds. Rey's confrontation with Hogan also influenced how wrestling media covered smaller performers. Instead of constantly questioning whether they were big enough for main event roles, journalists began focusing on skill, charisma, and connection with audiences as the primary measures of championship credibility. The conversation became a case study in how personal advocacy can drive systemic change. Rey had used his position as champion not just to entertain fans, but to educate industry leaders about unconscious bias and the importance of evaluating talent based on performance rather than appearance. Wrestling trainers began incorporating Rey's arguments into their programs, teaching future wrestlers that success came from dedication and skill rather than genetic advantages. The phrase "championship material comes in all shapes and sizes" became a rallying cry for wrestlers who had been told they weren't physically suited for main event success. Most importantly, Rey had honored Eddie Guerrero's final wishes while creating his own legacy as an advocate for change. His willingness to confront Hogan about broken promises had transformed potential betrayal into renewed commitment, ensuring that Eddie's vision for more inclusive wrestling would continue to influence the industry for years to come. The tragedy remained that Eddie never lived to see these changes, but through Rey's courage and articulate passion, his friend's final conversation with Hogan had achieved its intended impact. Size discrimination didn't disappear overnight, but the conversation had begun, and the wrestling world would never look at championship potential quite the same way again.